the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Hey, tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I will examine political events taking shape in South America. And we will detail how there is a presidential runoff election in Colombia this Saturday, and there has recently been elections in Chile, Nicaragua, Honduras and Peru. Paul will also take us through the political landscape and highlight what this means for populism, left-right ideologies, and for the South American continent and its respective political partners. For example, we will examine the so-called pink tide of supposed indigenous socialism started by Hugo Chavez and what relevancy this has had with regard to the Summit of Americas. And with respect to the Summit of Americas, we will use this event as a test of how far the United States has fallen as a global leader. So let's cross to Paul, and this is a highly specialised area of Paul Buchanan's, and looking forward to getting into this. And Paul's waiting online right now, so let's cross to him. Good afternoon, Paul. Tēnā koe eho.
Buenas tardes, mi amigo Selwyn.
Whoa,
Es un placer.
Perfect response considering the topic matter and the regions we're going to be discussing, Paul.
I thought I'd throw a little Spanish in there as a greeting, but kia ora as well. Great to be here once again.
Kia ora to you too. Paul, so let's take this from the top. If you can take us through the events, the election events. We know we've got the elections coming up on Saturday. You'll take us through that. Also, putting into context what results we've seen in recent times, and also if we look at Latin America, what are we looking at from the point of view of politics, its geopolitics, and certainly its engagement with its major partners?
We're in fact, we've got a runoff presidential election in Colombia on Saturday between the former leftist mayor of Bogota, Guillermo Petro, who's the front runner, and if he wins, he'll be the first freely elected leftist in Colombian history, versus a populist by the name of Rodolfo Hernandez, who styles himself as the TikTok king and who revels in his ignorance. He openly says that he's going to emulate Donald Trump in Colombian terms. So he speaks in gutter Spanish. He makes crass jokes. He's openly sexist. I mean, the guy is something else, but he's a millionaire. He has his own, he has a TikTok following. I think he owns a TV station. That's how these things tend to work. So that's going to be the latest. But we've had some interesting changes. I thought what I'd do is briefly run past how we came to this point, because Latin America right now is divided between left-leaning and right-leaning governments. Unfortunately, from my perspective, the only dictatorships in the region are left-leaning. And I'll get to that in a second. But let's run this brief history so we know how we got from there to here. Latin American matters because it is a testing ground for political and economic theory. Neoliberalism was trialed in Latin America before any other place, under the Chicago boys, who I happen to know pretty intimately, given that I studied there and actually took their courses. I took Milt Friedman's macro-micro sequence as part of my PhD studies. And I can't say that I agree with a word of what they teach, but that was trialed in Latin America in the 70s and 80s. New Zealand's interesting here because we had our fair share of Chicago boys, and New Zealand was the first democratic country to adopt a variant of neoliberalism directly copied from Chile. I mean, that's the dirty secret of Ruth Richardson and Richard Preble is they went for Pinochet's Chile as the model. They just couldn't do executing union leaders and that sort of thing in order to impose their vision.
Thankfully.
But not only that, Latin America is the region where national populism first emerged in the 30s.
Wow.
Guys like Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, Juan Perón in Argentina, Getulio Vargas in Brazil, all dictatorial leaders in the 30s, 40s, and 50s into the early 60s were all national populists.
Yeah,
And
is that kind of like Juan Perón, for example? Or, I'm very rudimentary in my knowledge of Latin America comparatively in this. I always thought that there was fascist elements. Is this the National Socialism type of elements that were there, or something quite different? Or?
Well, it's interesting because national populism got its inspiration from European fascism. In fact, Perón was Argentina's military attaché to Italy during the Mussolini years.
Ah.
And so he took, in fact, the Italian labor code under Mussolini became the Argentine labor code in the late 40s. But Perón and Cárdenas and Vargas was, 10 years removed from World War II. But they saw what happened to fascism. Not only that, they had an understanding that the economic circumstances of Latin America were not akin to those of Germany, Austria, and Italy. Remember, those were big industrial projects in Europe that fueled European fascism and the drive to war. In Latin America, you had agricultural-based economies. You didn't have that big industrial base. All of them tried to industrialize. That was it. They used an economic model known as import substitution industrialization, where rather than buy commodities from abroad, they built up nascent industries making toasters, refrigerators. They were inefficient because they built them from scratch. They didn't have economies of scale, but they were trying to become self-sufficient. And for a while, they were popular. But remember, they were not democratic. Okay, these were, they used elections as the way to get into power, and then they basically shut out the opposition. So you can see echoes of that in the populist movements that we see around the world today. And I'll get back to them in a second because populism is a feature of Latin American politics. The clearest example is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. He's, again, emulating Trump. And we may see, if this guy wins in Colombia, we may see a replication. But my point is that both in the economic front and the political front, Latin America has always been a bit of a guinea pig. It's always been a, if you will, a weather vane that gets picked up in other countries and other regions. And that's why it's important to us in New Zealand. As we look out over the political economic landscape, Latin America is a good guide to what may be coming down the road. And this brings me to a little historical exegesis in that, so neoliberalism ran its course in Latin America from the early 70s to the mid 90s. It privatized, it cost cut, it sold off, all sorts of state enterprises. Again, when I say privatized, welfare systems were turned over to private insurance conglomerates. Everything we hear in New Zealand, right, to this day, started there. And by the 1990s, it was very clear that that model was exhausted, that it promoted certain efficiencies in the economy, and it definitely benefited the elites who were able to leverage their position at the time states began to be privatized. I mean, this is sort of like the way Russian oligarchs took advantage of their positions in the Soviet state when things were privatized. Same thing happened before the Soviet Union collapsed in Latin America. Chile, again, being a perfect example. And so by the 1990s, you had those so-called deficiencies, but what you also had was outrageously growing income disparities. You had all the data from the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization demonstrated that the upper 10% were grabbing an increasingly big slice of the income pie at the expense of the lower 80%. The middle class was compressing. And many Latin American countries before the 70s had fairly large middle classes because many of them were employed in the state sector. Well, they got compressed. The lower classes, the poor, the working poor, and then those in poverty expanded exponentially. So civil society in Latin America began to resist, not rebel, but resist against the neoliberal model.
And
Now
the
we have
elites
to,
had militarized, hadn't they? And they were determined to hold.
well, but very good point, because it brings up the whole bit of armed struggle and what have you. In the 60s and 70s, Latin America was also a model for the armed struggle. I mean, you're looking at a guy who was part of it. And that involved urban and rural guerrilla warfare against military bureaucratic regimes. In my case, in Argentina, it was mostly urban, fighting the military. In Brazil, there was a lot of rural warfare. Bolivia, of course, we remember Che Guevara's ill-fated internationalist mission. The armed struggle continued well into the late 80s, and in some cases, it was successful in Nicaragua. But here's the rub. Most of the armed struggle movements were defeated by US backed military regimes who violated human rights systematically, who trampled over the rights of the people in order to find the guerrillas because they bought into the idea that the population is the sea in which the guerrilla fishes swim. So they killed a lot of innocents in order to prove their supremacy. And in most instances, they won. Again, backed by US weapons, backed by US intelligence. I'm not a raving, workers' world type, but again, I have intimate knowledge of that reality. I lost friends to the Argentine dictatorship, so I'm not kidding around here. What happened, though, is that first of all of the revolutionary leftist regimes, like that of Nicaragua, eventually turned into dictatorships. Not a single one of them resulted in the democracy that they promised, the people's democracy, social democracy, nothing of the sort. They adopted a Leninist approach to political organization and they ran with it, and that still exists in Nicaragua today. And of course, Cuba is the foremost example of that. On the other hand, the military dictatorships were so brutal, imposing the neoliberal vision, the excesses they committed. Many people don't talk about the genocidal approach to indigenous affairs. We tend to concentrate on the amount of white people they killed. It depended. I mean, the Argentines are not the Chileans, are not the Bolivians, are not the Brazilians. But at one point, most of Latin America was governed by variations of military bureaucratic regimes in which capital elites married with the military high command in a project of extermination of leftists, anyone who opposed that particular neoliberal model. This extended all the way up to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So you get to the mid 90s after all of this, and beginning in the 80s, there was a push to democratize. Not so much the economic model. It turns out, and again, this is why Latin America is such a great laboratory. People wanted they wanted freedom under any economic model. They were tired of being repressed. And there's an old adage in political science that when repression is the basis of rule, it obeys a form of Newtonian law. It wanes over time. You cannot repress the same amount of people forever. You simply cannot, partly because the repressors themselves lose the will to keep on killing. And I know this for a fact based on my experiences in Argentina. The sergeants and soldiers who did the actual killing of dissidents and anyone else who got in their way did so on the orders of the elites, the generals, But they received no economic benefit for doing that. They just became mass murderers. And so even they started to lose the stomach for continuing to kill when it was apparent that all the guerrillas were gone. They were either dead or had fled into exile. So you get to the mid 90s, and what begins to emerge is what came to be known as the pink tide. And the pink tide is a move to the left, but under democratic circumstances. This is not the armed revolutionary left anymore. They learned their lessons. This is a democratic socialist left. Now, in Latin America, the name came to be known as indigenous socialism, with the emphasis either on indigenous, let's say in the case of Evo Morales in Bolivia, who is an indigenous person, or socialist, in the case of, let's say, Lula Ignacio da Silva in Brazil.
And just to on the Bolivian issue, I mean, people would think of Bolivia and the indigenous people with the bowler type hats, the very cool, stylish hats. They were banned from being able to wear them. The oppression didn't allow them to express themselves in such a way, did they? Until recent times, in a sense.
Yeah, that was a feature of the dictatorship of Hugo Banzer, again, a figure in the 1970s who actually tried to suppress all forms of indigenous identity expression. He wanted to homogenize the country under the Creole elite, because Bolivians are copper skinned, but there's been a lot of intermixing between the descendants of the white colonialists and then indigenous folk, who, by the way, just to throw this out in the beginning, white people tend to treat indigenous people as if they were all the same, homogeneous. It's like saying American Indian in the United States. They're not. Okay, they're human beings. They come in all sizes, shapes, and flavors. So, well, I say this because Hugo Morales comes from eastern Bolivia, and he was a union leader, an agricultural union leader, before he went into politics. And that he ran afoul of the dictatorships, which later on in this period in the 90s propelled him to the presidency. The seeds for his presidency were sown in his struggles against the dictatorship of Banzer and his successors. Well, the leading champion of the vision of indigenous socialism, which, if I was to generalize it, is Latin American socialism with an indigenous face. But again, the emphasis, depending on the country, was either on indigenous rights or socialism, or some variation of social democracy. And who emerges in the 1990s as the leading proponent of this vision is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, a former army colonel who had attempted 3 coups against the democratic regime of Venezuela that existed before he came to power. What many people don't know now is that Venezuela, at one point, had the highest income per capita in all of Latin America thanks to its oil revenues. Most of that was appropriated by an elite that did power sharing between 2 parties, a party called COPE, which leaned to the left, and a party called Acción Democrática, which leaned to the right.
Like a grand coalition type thing, is it?
Yeah, well, they alternated in power. So they made it seem as if they were competitive, but they were not. They all had their hands in the trough. And Chavez called them on it. If you look at Venezuela, that elite is white. The rest of the country is variations of coffee with milk color. So Chavez, who has indigenous blood in him, he called them on it, and he started staging coups. Now, the coups failed, and he was in prison. Now, I'll just say as an aside, not to be show my darker side, but there is an axiom of coup plotting that, again, I've seen at close range, which is if you oust somebody in a coup, make sure he does not survive. All right? He doesn't live through the armed moment. Because if you allow him to survive, he's going to come back and he's going to haunt you. That's what Chavez did. They let him live when they imprisoned him. There was no accident in prison. Worse yet for them, that is the Venezuelan elites, they allowed him to do his sentence in a military prison that was the property, if you will, of the army. He was an army colonel, a paratrooper, and so he kept on plotting and scheming. And when they let him out, he had an idea of Venezuela with a socialist economy, but where the indigenous majority would have more rights. And he won handily the election of 1999. That was the first electoral victory. And he inspired a wave of indigenous socialists up and down the continent, including Evo Morales. But there were others. I mean, there was Lula. There were, of course, the Concertación governments in Chile that were more oriented towards social democracy than indigenous rights. Up and down in Ecuador, with the exception of Colombia, Ecuador was run by leftists for 20 some odd years, again, doing the indigenous socialist model. Peru, for a while, had a variation of that under a guy called Ullanta Humala, who was a mestizo, so half caste, indigenous and white. That had its day in the 2000s. But here's the unfortunate fact. All of those experiments wound up descending into kleptocracies, with the exception of the Chileans, the Brazilians to a lesser extent, and they all wound up descending into variations of dictatorship, some harder, some softer, but they were by no means fully democratic in their approach to political competition.
If you were looking at that, with Venezuela, for example, if you look at Chavez, his deteriorating health, cancer, did that have a play on his leadership? Did they fall into the easy way of totalitarianism to a degree on the back end of that, do you think?
They did, because he, unfortunately, the cancer, and this is just an interesting aside about Chavez. Chavez had bowel cancer. And, this tells you something about Latin American mores in some countries. He did not want to reveal that he had that specific form of cancer because it came from the lower end, and he was afraid that people would think he was a homosexual. So he delayed treatment. He swore his family and others to silence. And by the time he got to Cuba to be treated, it was all over. He was terminal. At that point, word leaked out. He did not reveal what had happened. He just, I'm sick. This is the way it is. Word started to get out amongst his wider circle that, he had this illness. And in some ways, he was correct. Some people in the political environment of Venezuela began to circulate rumors about his orientation. All of that started undermining him. So his response was to turn around and harden his rule, and more importantly, for questions of his legacy, because remember, he coined the phrase Bolivarian revolution. Peaceful with elections on the way in, and then you manipulate elections to stay in power. Well, he nominated his vice president, Nicolás Maduro, who was known not only for his stupidity, but for his utterly supplicant approach to Chavez. Maduro was the head of the bus drivers union in Caracas. Again, not the brightest bulb. And he is the president of Venezuela today. He's been in power since 2013. And he's a full-on authoritarian despot. There is no pretense of democracy in Venezuela anymore. What's even worse is he's presiding not only over a kleptocracy, but over an incompetent one. This is an oil-producing country that has
should
to
be
import,
right up there. Yeah.
Right. Well, and they have to import oil.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, so if you want an example, right-wingers always point to Venezuela, rightfully so, that this is what happens to socialism, okay? No, this is what happens when corruption, greed, and incompetence come into office under the guise of socialism.
And
That's
as
the
a
truth.
consequence, we've seen a tide of people leaving the country, trying to find their lives in Bolivia and Ecuador and other parts nearby. Yeah. So, and destabilization. So we're getting to the point where we've got a series of elections and things like that. So all of what you've detailed is the backstory to it. That's the cause of what people can see today. What's the effect, Paul?
Well, what's happened in the teens is because, the dictators have been largely discredited on the right. And because there is no armed struggle alternative to speak of. I mean, the good news is that the violent political socialization that I experienced as a teenager, as my political consciousness arose, no longer exists. Okay, people are not going that route on the left. And so right now we see countries we see the region evenly divided between left leaning and right leaning. And so let me enumerate them. The right leaning regimes are Uruguay, which has a very reasonable right center coalition running it, Bolsonaro in Brazil, which is an extremist authoritarian regime posing as a democracy. It has a right center government in Ecuador. It may have another right center government under this crazy man in Colombia as of Saturday. It has right leaning governments in Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica. But again, all, with the exception of Guatemala, all fairly moderate. And it has leftist regimes, left leaning, running Mexico, running Peru, which has an indigenous president, a full Highland Indian president, who was the head of the school teachers union. It has an indigenous socialist president in Chile, Gabriel Boric. And what's interesting about Boric is he's from Patagonia. You and I off camera were mentioning Ushuaia on the Argentine side.
Yeah.
Boric is from Punta Arenas, which is on the Chilean side of Tierra del Fuego. So he's the first Patagonian.
It weaves in and out, doesn't it? Geographically.
Yep, indeed. In fact, Punta Arenas is closer to Ushuaia than it is to Santiago. I mean, it's proximate to Argentine Patagonia. So that's a first. And he's an interesting guy because he's mostly white, but his project is indigenous and socialist. I mean, he's really trying to balance the scales. And for people who don't know what's going on in Chile right now, they're running a constitutional assembly to get rid of Pinochet's constitution, which still is in force, with something new. And the constituents to this assembly, a full 30 to 40% are indigenous people, mostly female. They're really pushing the envelope. Let's put it that way, and making something different out of Chile. Needless to say, the Chilean elites who benefited by the Pinochet regime are not happy with this. So we got to watch that space because that's a disloyal opposition that has serious racist undertones and doesn't like socialism at all. Then they've made the point that they overthrew and murdered Allende, because the idea that Allende died by suicide is debatable, at least. And they've made hints that they're willing to do this again if they go too far. But Boric is an indigenous socialist. So you have, in Bolivia, you have a successor to Morales. Now we have to remember this. Morales was ousted by a coup. And he fled first to Venezuela. He realized that was not good. So he wound up in Argentina. His successor, the female president of Congress who helped oust him, along with the military, she was ousted a year and a half later for corruption. It was just too obvious to the military that she and all those right-wing cronies that ousted Morales were a bunch of thieves. So she was just sentenced 2 days ago to 10 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement. In the meantime, Guillermo Arce, who was Morales' interior minister back in the day being 4 years ago, he's now the president. He's left-leaning. So we got left-leaning. You notice I haven't said much about Argentina.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. What's the situation there? Because some interesting kind of elections have occurred there, haven't they?
Yeah. The trouble is this. I guess I know too much about Argentina. Again, I'm not blowing my own horn here, but I grew up there, and that's where my political socialization began. They've had a number of Peronist regimes. Okay, so you would think at first glance that these populist-based regimes, right? They're sort of cut from Perón's cloth, but it's been diluted over the years. You think that they're leftists, but they're not. They're incredibly corrupt. They're kleptocratic. They take that to an art form, but they're populist in that they redistribute wealth downwards from the state coffers to keep on getting elected, to keep people happy. If you have a population that doesn't understand, things like trade balances, that you need to sell abroad as much as you bring in or balance, the scales, then you can get away with populist policies. You can just throw money at problems. So the Peronists basically dominated the years after the dictatorship ended in the mid 80s. But again, it became so obvious that it was just a cabal of thieves that in the 2010s, a right-wing coalition won presidential and congressional elections under a guy called Guillermo Hugo Macri, who was a big entrepreneur. Again, one of these, big businessmen.
And inflation had been soaring, hadn't it? In the lead up to all of this, we were hearing it globally. We were hearing it down here in New Zealand, about inflation, where the price of something basic like say butter, for example, within a month it's double the price.
Easily. They were running inflation rates over 100% a week.
Yeah.
For a while. It was crazy. You would an item that you would buy in the morning,
and the World Bank and International Monetary Fund and others got involved, didn't they, to try and actually settle it down? But these are side issues, aren't they?
Yeah. Again, we could go on forever. Argentina has reneged on its sovereign debt twice. Okay, just we don't have the money. And what they do is the populist leaders will turn to the population and say these foreign imperialists are squeezing us, squeezing the blood out of the hardworking Argentine in order to get their pound of flesh, when it was the very policies that they enacted that caused them to accrue the debt in the first place. Remember, they borrowed in order to, they subsidized, let's say, electricity, they subsidize, winter heating, but on a scale that we don't even see here in New Zealand with some of the little subsidies for the elderly. So what happens? Macri comes in, and lo and behold, he turns around and uses a version of neoliberalism. This is 20 years after it was discredited, and tries to impose this on a population that's gotten used to populist policies. Let's just say that Macri was remarkably successful given the opposition of the Peronists. But eventually he couldn't run by constitutional order. He could only run twice. And so he did his 2 terms for a total of 8 years. And he left 2 years ago, and now we have another Peronist in power. But I'm reluctant to add Argentina to the left-right dichotomy because Peronism is such a fractured political movement. Again, it's a movement, not a party. That you have right-wing Peronists, some of the biggest allies of the military dictatorships, killers and thugs, were right-wing Peronists. And then there are the progressive Peronists, who some of whom I count amongst my friends, who are still in the game. And, they just shake their heads when I ask them, what the hell's happening with Peronism? They're like, we're so splintered. It's not, they said, yes, we're a movement, but we're really nothing. At this point, there's an umbrella. We all pile under it to beat the right wing. and then we go back to fighting amongst ourselves. The key point here is that after all that history, we have Latin America more or less evenly divided between right-leaning and left-leaning governments. And I guess the good news is that, with the exception of the Nicaraguan dictatorship, which is increasingly brutal, and the Bolsonaro regime, which is tending to that, let's just dwell for a second on Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, of course, openly has said that he has styled himself on Trump, and so he says racist things. He's a clear misogynist. His two sons, who are minor politicians in the Rio de Janeiro area, are both the heads of death squads that are linked to the Brazilian mafia. But he has the support of evangelical Christians and some factions in the military. He was a military
and Vladimir Putin on a global scale.
Yeah. Well, see, that's why the transnationalized nature of national populism needs to be addressed, because yes, they like Putin, they like Viktor Orban, they like Erdogan in Turkey, these strongman types. Key for me as a student of civil military relations, he was an Army major before his political career. Parts of the Army are backing him, but they're backing him in a very bad way, because he is now saying in June, before the October election, and his rival in the October election is Lula, who has gotten out of jail. He was thrown in jail for 2 years on trumped up corruption charges. Let's put it this way. In the Brazilian scheme of things, if Lula was corrupt, then he's the shoeshine man version of corruption compared to some of the oligarchs that Brazil has. Anyway, he spent 2 years in jail. He comes out. Right now, the polls have him leading 65% to 35%. Ahead of Bolsonaro. What is Bolsonaro's response? There's going to be election fraud. They're going to steal the election from me. I'm not going to allow it.
Stop the steal.
Stop the steal. And here's the thing. He's watched the Trump thing. He watched January 6th. And what he is saying now is, if we lose that election, it's been stolen. We must hit the streets and use force to overcome that theft. He's already calling for his people to engage in violence to overthrow the results that at this point look massively in favor of Lula. That's not good for Brazil, at a minimum.
Does Brazil have the institutions? I mean, there is an argument, isn't there, that the United States saved itself to a degree because of the independence of some of the institutions that had not been overly taken over by Trumpism. That's a broad argument, but there's an argument there. For example, General Miley and others, developing an independent thing. What's Brazil got?
I'm afraid they don't. They don't have the institutional strength. I may be proven wrong. And if there aren't any Brazilian listeners who want to correct me, but their Congress is a shambles, and again, awash in corruption. The military, the Brazilian military is pretty professional. And they had sworn to stay out of politics after their experience ruling Brazil from 1964 to 1985. But this announcement that some elements in the army are going to back Bolsonaro in any event is really bad for the Brazilian military's professionalism. I mean, I can foresee fighting between army factions, much less the Air Force and the Navy. And then it's bad for society as a whole. The judiciary in Brazil, I'll be polite and say it's problematic at best. So, no, I don't think Brazil has the institutional resilience to peacefully resolve a disputed election, particularly if the results are as massive in favor of Lula as everybody's predicting. Then the only way Bolsonaro can overcome it is with force, right? There's no institutional arrangement that's going to come out in his favor because, again, the vote was so overwhelmingly in favor of Lula. I mean, you can't stuff
Yeah.
that much.
What
So
what comes to mind there is a comparative element, if you like, in Belarus, all the way over on the other continent, the great European continent, and with Lukashenko and what he did in the last elections, for example. It looks like there was a clear win by the surge of democratically elected people that were representing a massive shift in the population's want in Belarus. But the
yeah,
response
yeah,
was
yeah. I mean,
dictatorial. Now, all I'm doing is a comparative thing that
yeah.
Bolsonaro has Trump to compare to model his response on, and there is a means of which he can see on how another dictator, another authoritarian leader has achieved the desired result from their point of view.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think that, at first I was thinking, that's stretching it, just because Belarus has never been, a real democracy, if you will. But no, I think actually the point is well taken, because he's taking his inspiration from strong, quote unquote, strong men.
Yeah.
And so it's not within the realm of impossibility that he would see Lukashenko and go, if you can just crack down for 3 or 4 months, then the dissidents will all, wither away, melt away. But let's get to the role of the United States and into the
Yeah,
Summit of the Americas.
Summit of the Americas. What does all
Yeah,
this
but
mean for it?
yeah. And so, so the general history is, dictatorship, neoliberalism, move to indigenous socialism that is not about armed struggle, variations of indigenous socialism, some more indigenous, some more socialistic, and now the reentry of center right coalitions that are not fully neoliberal anymore, with a few exceptions that are more market oriented, but are a lot softer. I would say right now, the moment is of relative softness in politics compared to when I grew up there. And that's a good thing. The young people of Latin America are more mellow, even though there are some major social issues. COVID did a number on Latin America. There's been 1,700,000 deaths in Latin America. There's some outrageous amount of cases. Again, incompetence in government, corruption in government led to a lot of that. But where's the United States been in all of this? And unfortunately, on the wrong side of history, pretty much all the way. Let me just run it back. Those neoliberal military bureaucratic dictatorships, as well as the authoritarian regimes, the personalist authoritarian regimes that preceded them, like Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua, Alberto Stroessner in Paraguay. Paraguay, incidentally, is right center in orientation right now. The Argentine dictators, the Brazilian dictators, the Bolivians, the Chileans, the Peruvians. All those dictatorships were backed by the United States. Every single one of them. Jimmy Carter's human rights policy in the late 70s was an exception to the rule of unqualified support. And here's why. They were anti-communist. That was it. The obsession, the US obsession with anti-communism, which continues to this day, if you can believe it, outweighed everything else. Real small anecdote here to illustrate the point. When I took my first post PhD job, it was to create a Latin American studies program at the Naval Postgraduate School for military and civilian intelligence officials. So CIA guys and then military attaches. Eventually they became that. I had to get a top secret clearance in order to read their MA theses and that sort of thing. And I expected trouble because I had been a member of the Montoneros guerrilla group in Argentina, which was the armed left-wing faction of the Peronist movement at that time. This is late 60s, early 70s. So I thought, the fact that I had engaged in armed struggle, and then later in Central America, I returned to the fray in the late 70s, that would cause some problems. Instead, I was asked continuously, polygraphed, the works, are you a communist? Have you belonged to a communist party? Do you advocate the overthrow of the United States government? And I could honestly say to all three, no. I had never been a member of the Communist Party of the US. I had never been a member of a Communist Party in Latin America. I was a Peronist. And I didn't advocate the overthrow of the U.S. government. No. So I got the clearances. This was in the 1980s. All right, the Cold War was winding down. When I got to the Pentagon in the 1990s, I needed an even higher clearance because I was the head Latin American guy. What we call an SCI clearance. They asked me the same questions. This is 1993. The same bloody questions. And I was goofing on them. I'm like, seriously? I said, well, to be honest with you, I'm sort of like a Euro-Marxist. I'm a neo-Gramscian. So I believe in the war of position, not the war of maneuver. And these guys just looked at me as if I was stoned out of my mind. So I realized, they're locked into this mindset. I say this because all those indigenous socialist regimes, the U.S. opposed. All of them. Morales, even the Chilean Concertación, certainly, between Chavez and Maduro, they sort of earned some of the opprobrium. But my point is this: the United States, even to this day, backs anyone who's an anti-communist, even though communism in Latin America exists as this infinitesimally small party movement. Yeah, there's communist parties in countries, but there might be 5,000 members. More importantly, they misread indigenous socialism as something nefarious that is funded from abroad, when in fact the word indigenous should have alerted them this is native born, this is organic, this comes from within, in resistance to the neoliberal project and the right-wing dictatorships.
Yeah, a move of survival in some ways that was politicized. And the framework advances the means to that, in many of those cases that you've identified there. If people want to do a comparison, the big misrepresentation or misunderstanding with respect to Vietnam all those years ago with the Vietnam War is that there was an ignorance around what that fight was from the West looking at that looks like it's a fight against communism. From the Vietnamese side, it was trying to get their country back from colonialists.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there we are.
The whole domino theory thing, which, was actually used in Latin America. The same ideas propelled. Now, let's cut to the chase. And I was socialized in Argentina, politically socialized. The United States is, with very few exceptions, Obama was fairly well liked, is deeply resented by most of the Latin American political classes, unless they can curry favor with the U.S. by towing that anti-communist line. And so they'll play the United States' relative ignorance over Latin America to accrue some sectarian favor. But the majority of publics, voting people in these countries, aren't fans of the United States. And this is set to continue because the vision of Latin America amongst the foreign policy elites of the United States is dominated by the Cuban exile lobby and now increasingly by the Venezuelan exile lobby. The elites of Cuba and Venezuela, 40 to 50 years apart, fled their home countries rather than accept socialism. And they're mostly they mostly reside in South Florida, but they are a very significant lobbying force. Not quite National Rifle Association powerful, but extremely powerful. And they put a lot of money in politicians' pockets come election time for the United States to keep its policy of anti-communism first. So those are the domestic origins, because Congress is owned when it comes to Latin America by the Cuban Venezuelan lobby. And I saw this firsthand. I mean, many people don't know, but I spent some time in the State Department as a fellow in the Latin American division. The Cubans were all over it. That was in the late 80s. Then in the Pentagon, dealing with the bloody Cubans.
So you're
You
talking
know,
Cuban exiles here, aren't you?
yeah,
Yeah.
and their sons and daughters and descendants.
Yep.
Because
The,
power accrues from that single-minded orientation, but it blinds you to the realities of Latin America. Cuba's a small island state. Argentina is huge. Brazil is immense. Argentina is not Brazil, and they certainly are not Cuba. Same with Venezuela. It's got a lot of oil. But in the scheme of things, Mexico is far more important, economically to the United States. So that's the domestic origin. And then there's the one, what I would say, fatal blow to the United States' influence in Latin America, and that is the People's Republic of China. China has shown up in Latin America bearing gifts.
yeah.
Everything we see here in the South Pacific, been there, done that in Latin America. The Chinese, the three biggest countries producing lithium for our electric batteries, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. You know who controls 50% of that market? Chinese firms. The biggest firms in Chilean copper are partnerships between the Chilean state and Chinese firms. I could go down a range of major strategic economic activities. China's all over that like a rash. Where is the United States? Nowhere to be seen because they're too busy barking about communism.
So we had the Summit of Americas, and if we use that as a test on the United States' reputation on the continent, the southern continent, for example, you painted a pretty persuasive picture there. What does that say for the United States regionally, external, regional, and global?
Well, let's put it this way. The United States, this is under Biden, and the summit just happened last week. The United States, before the summit, disinvited Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. All right, said you're not welcome. That doesn't happen. The Summit of the Americas is not about your differences of opinion, ideological difference, whatnot. It's about all the leaderships of the region to get together, hash out deals. It's supposed to be friendly. So what does the U.S. do? This is under Biden. No, you guys can't come. In solidarity with the Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, the president of Honduras, whose husband was ousted by a right-wing coup, backed by the Obama administration, she decides that she's going to go solidarity with the leftist regime, so she's not going. Then the Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, he decides, I'm not going because this is an affront. So right there, 5 countries are not in. The president of Uruguay had COVID, so he couldn't go. That's right. And then the president Arce of Bolivia, he didn't go in solidarity with his leftist colleagues. And then Guatemala and El Salvador refused to send their presidents because of U.S. migration policy, because Biden hasn't dismantled the Trump era wall, the migration, the caging of children. I guess they took the cages down, but now they're
wearing ICE, as people know it, yeah?
Exactly. So you wind up with 8 or 9 countries that don't send their presidents in opposition to what the United States is doing. Now, Argentina did. Boric and Chile went. All the small countries, the small Caribbean states went. This is what Bolsonaro does. Bolsonaro says openly before the summit that he will not go unless A, the United States does not talk to him about his claims that there's going to be electoral fraud, right? He doesn't want to hear about it. His claims. And secondly, the United States cannot talk to him about the fact that he has repeatedly said in public that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president because Donald Trump won the election. Those are my two conditions. Biden agreed to them. He wanted a private bilateral with Biden. Those were the conditions he imposed. The United States agreed to that. Now, Selwyn, let me say this to you. You know how I feel about the United States in Latin America in particular, and the broader abroad. So if the United States presence in Latin America is diminished, even though I have concerns about China, it's for the Latin Americans to decide what they're going to do with China. But can you imagine any point in, let's say, the last 100 years that Latin American countries, including small Latin American countries, would thumb their noses at the United States at a meeting in the United States, hosted by the United States, and go, nah, we're not going.
And dictate the terms in the case of the. So why did Biden do that? Is he still feeling bruised and battered from the point of view of domestically? The United States has many people that are obviously Trump followers. Bannonism is huge. They look across the aisle, they can see expressions of that, even though people know that Trump and others have lied all the way through relating to the election fraud. And they look at Bolsonaro and they're thinking, well, it's not worth stirring this up. We will go with the silence options. Thanks very much.
Yeah, there could be. I mean, I think what's going on, again, as I was about to say, besides the insult factor, I mean, again, this is supposedly a superpower, right? I mean, you're openly insulting the president of this superpower, who, by the way, under the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, supposedly is the military guarantor of regional security. How's that working out? I think, beyond the utter insult of places like El Salvador to the U.S., here's what's going on. I think the calculus in most Latin American capitals is that Joe Biden is a lame duck, that the Republicans are going to retake Congress in November. Then he will be a lame duck because he will be able to do anything. And then either Trump or some Trump wannabe will become president in 2024. And now that you have liberal media outlets openly speculating that Biden's cognitive abilities are on the decline, where Democrats are openly talking to the press about urging Biden not to run again because of his cognitive decline, I think the more insolent of the Latin American countries have decided, you know what? We can give him the finger because he can't do anything about it. As you say, I mean, the Republicans, in Congress, they're not going to bark at Biden because a bunch of lefty presidents decided not to go to the summit. But if you take the macro view of a great power in decline, this failed summit of the Americas, nothing got done. I mean, nothing got done. There were some minor bilateral trade deals struck horizontally between smaller countries. Yep. Nothing got done with regards to the United States. This is palpable, crystallized evidence of the U.S. in decline. I mean, this is it. You look at that and you're like, it's over. It is over, at least in Latin America. Given the U.S. history in Latin America, now that China's there as an alternative partner, I think they're done. And I always remember, I mean, not to beat the drum about anti-communism. When I first went to the United States to go to university, I was so different in my political science classes to everybody else because of my socialization that one of my wiser professors, he decided to do like back and forth with me in order for the others to realize there's a different way of looking at the world. And he says to me, pretty much knowing what I was about to say, he says, "Oh, Pablo, so don't you worry about communism?" And I said to him, "Communism?" I said, "Look, in Latin America, we haven't seen any Russians. There's no Chinese here. Right now, what we do see is the U.S. militarily intervene in Latin America all the time, and not against dictators, but against progressive presidents. Every time someone manages to win power who's on the left, the US, overtly or covertly, overthrows them. So, no, for me, the threat to Latin America is the United States. And quite frankly, I still believe that to this day. So, now with China as the alternative, the US has not remedied its view of Latin America with this anti communist stuff. It is now deeply resented. I mean, just think when the United States, its pundits, refer to Latin America as its backyard. Not even any hint of understanding what that conveys.
Yeah.
I think that resentment is now crystallized into official leadership. I won't say repudiation because everybody wants the Yanks' money. But with China as an alternative, I think you're going to see more, not less, rejection of U.S. initiatives and overtures to the Latin American countries, as well intentioned as they may be. And that's unfortunate for the United States, but perhaps it'll be for the betterment of Latin America as a region.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul, for taking us through that. And it's a fascinating kind of examination, really, of a part of the world that we in the Asia Pacific region often, while we share the same seasons and share some of the export goods, the commodity-based agricultural products, etc., we have little understanding of, despite those similarities. Really appreciate that, and it's been a great lesson to be personally as well. Now, it may be in future episodes we work toward examining the inside of the United States as it is now. Biden has been in for a while. We've got the midterms coming up at the end of this year. There's a lot of talk around what that may mean. We've also seen the January 6th inquiry becoming public, with a lot of Trump's insiders as the closest advisors, Albert Barr, for example, the Attorney General, speaking absolutely forthright in many respects, exposing Trump and stripping him to the bare bones of what he is behind the scenes. What effect that may have on the American voting public in the midterms. There's a lot to examine. When we come back in future episodes, perhaps we'll tackle that tiger. And I don't mean a paper one either.
It'll be a whip around.
It'll be a whip around. Okay, Paul, take care. And to the audience, thank you very much for taking part in this live recording, and also for those that are listening or viewing it on demand. We hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you walk away a lot more knowledgeable as a consequence. Until next time, take care. Ka kite anō.